a very controversial one for a Californian. And as I was thinking about this, suddenly images began to come back to me. I thought about the sanctuary movement along the Mexican border in the 1980s that was staffed by many of my fellow Quakers. The sanctuary movement, of course, intentionally violated U.S. border laws in order to provide asylum for Latin Americans who were escaping torture in countries that had official ties with the United States. The Reagan administration, as some of you remember, refused to classify these people as refugees. Therefore, they were not allowed in the United States because we had official ties to their regime. Yet Jim Corbett, the Quaker organizer who was a leader of this movement, is, I would have to say, a model good coyote. And of course, to go even further back in American history, forgive me if I'm somewhat proud of some of my Quaker forebears in the 19th century, who I consider to be the good coyotes who ran the Underground Railway that took many African Americans from the South in slavery to the North and into Canada and freedom. Harriet Tubman, the famous Black Moses, who led over 300 slaves to the North and freedom, is another good coyote. Now, there's a great Willie Nelson song that says, "All my heroes have always been cowboys." And as I thought about that song, I realized, you know what? The fact of the matter is, all my heroes have always been coyotes. I think, for example, of John Howard Griffin, a deeply devoted Catholic layman who in 1959 colored his skin black and then lived in the South. He could only handle it for 3 months and wrote his famous book, Black Like Me. Now, that book has been criticized sometimes fairly, but Black Like Me taught 2 generations of white Americans some of the realities of racism in the South. Well, John Howard Griffin was quite a coyote. He crossed the color border to try to learn what the realities were. I think, for example, of Uri Avnery, an Israeli activist who persisted in meeting with Yasser Arafat even when it was illegal to meet with the enemy. I think of Issam Sartawi, the Palestinian doctor who once organized military resistance to Israel, but then came to believe in peaceful negotiation. He was killed by hardliners precisely because of his willingness to meet with Israelis to discuss peace. I think of Taner Aksam, the Turkish historian who openly and compassionately writes about the truth of the Armenian massacre. He has infuriated fellow Turks who still deny that it ever took place. There's a good coyote. I think of Dr. Ronald Sunni, the Armenian historian who has accepted any and all invitations to go to Turkey itself to speak on the genocide. And he regularly engages in dialogue with Turks whenever he can. Another good coyote. I think of Mahmoud Taha, who was known as the African Gandhi. He was a Muslim teacher who defended equal rights for Christians and non-Christians in the southern Sudan, and was a fearless advocate of equal rights for women. I think of the brave critics of the Crusades, William of Occo, Isaac Latour, who spoke out against the medieval Christian hatred that fed those horrible wars against Islam. And finally, I think of John Woolman, the American Quaker who refused to wear dyed cloth because dyed cloth, he discovered in his day, was all produced by slave labor. So I'm sympathetic to the need to sometimes violate borders in the name of peace and justice. Recently, however, I've come to understand that this holy border running is a deeply biblical idea. Therefore, I'd like to simply mention two examples of this. Now, in ancient Israel, across the Jordan, in what is today the country of Jordan, were a number of small entities, small countries, we would say, although that's a little bit strong. They were really sort of tribal associations. Two of them were known as Ammon, in the area where the capital of Jordan now is, Amman. So there was once a group of people called the Ammonites, and below them, further south, closer to the Dead Sea, was a number of people who were known as Edomites. Edomites. Now, as you read through the Hebrew Scriptures, what you will find is there is considerable hatred in many places expressed towards the Ammonites and the Edomites. You will find many angry denunciations of both groups, the Edomites and the Moabites. And yet, there are other voices. For example, in the book of Genesis, there's a famous story. I'm sure many of you are familiar with it. The story is the story of two brothers, Jacob and Esau. Jacob and Esau's father was Isaac. And Isaac was blind. He couldn't see. Isaac had his two sons, Jacob and Esau, and they were quite different. But Esau was the firstborn. And Esau was the great hunter. He was apparently a big burly man. And Jacob was the herdsman and agricultural worker. He was considered a bit smaller. And the time came when Isaac was to deliver the great blessing to the firstborn child. Well, Jacob wanted that blessing. He wanted the advantages that came from that. So it says that his mother, who sided with him, your classic mama's boy, I suppose, dressed up Jacob, it said, put on skins so that when Isaac would reach out to feel his son, he would feel the hairiness of son Esau, he thought. But it was in fact Jacob. So he puts the blessing on Jacob. Apparently this was not something he could revoke and say, oh, I'm sorry, wrong son, let me do this again. Once spoken, it was done. So Jacob, of course, receives the blessing and then escapes, because it says immediately that his brother Esau, when he found out, he said, I will kill my brother Jacob for what he has taken from me. He has taken the blessing. So Jacob takes off. According to the tradition, Jacob has to work for 14 years for a rather corrupt herdsman by the name of Laban. And then at the end of that's another story. Then at the end of the 14 years, he has to go back to the homeland. And in order to go back to the homeland, according to the tradition, he must pass through the land of Esau, his estranged brother. Now, the story gets quite powerful. It says that Jacob begins to send gifts out ahead of him to Esau. And finally, it says there's a particular Hebrew word for the gifts that he's sending minchot, right? Gifts. Then finally it says the last thing he sends out ahead of him is the barakah, the blessing, the same word as the blessing that he stole from his brother. So he sends all this out, and he sheepishly sends his family out ahead, and then he comes along afterwards thinking, well, if he attacks and kills me, at least my family will live. And the Bible sets the story up rather powerfully. It says that Esau shows up to meet his brother with 400 men. In many places in the Bible where it talks about 400 men, it always means an army, right? We get the point. He's showing up, and he's going to do in his brother. Justice will be served. And there is this powerful moment in the story where Jacob, having given back the blessing, cowers before his brother, and his brother runs up and embraces him.